So my name's Linda Hunter and I work in the Scottish Government and I'm a delivery lead working on one of the actions that's associated with National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group's action plan and the new national strategy for suicide prevention, Creating Hope for Scotland. So I say that because I feel like I sit in two camps. I'm in government doing this work, but I'm part of a delivery collaborative that spans spectrum organisation working around suicide prevention, including the lived experience panel, which is an absolutely critical part of our work. So what I was just thinking about, everything that Shamela spoke about earlier on just really resonated with me around where this work has come from. And then the conversation that we've just had around resourcing things well and considering this work and the principles behind this work really stand true for what we've done around time, space, compassion as well. But what I thought might be interesting to do today is just share a wee bit of our story so far and trying to work in that way and bring it to the work we're doing around suicidal crisis response in Scotland. So just in case this area of work is newer to you, I've dropped a couple of links into the chat. So you can follow up and do a little bit more reading if you want to do that. And I've also included my contact details if you'd like to have more of a conversation with me about it and how it might link to what you're doing. But just to put this in a little bit of context and framing, the work we're doing around time, space, compassion, and I'll describe it just in a little bit more detail in a moment, as I said, comes from the NSPLG, or the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group's action plan. That the last iteration of it was put in place in October 2021, but we've just had a refresh of that through the publication of the new Scotland's new suicide prevention strategy. And the action I'm working on is just one piece. So there's a full gamut of actions that look at the tactical, practical, and we would put ourselves in the position of working on the relational elements of working around suicide prevention. So in 21, there was a piece of research done around what can we do and what can we learn about suicidal crisis response and how can we improve it. And that, I think what's really interesting, the thing that caught my attention and brought me to this work was that had started off as a fairly technical piece of work about looking at what was happening across Scotland and looking for a model. And like these pieces of work often find out, and we only ever really connect with this when we're in the midst of the work, is that, well, things are in different places in different places. The assets and the response that different communities and different localities need are very different. So obviously one size isn't going to fit all. And I think the other thing that came through was that we don't yet know enough about what the common practices are across those responses to be able to make a unified response. And there was this sort of little magic moment, I think, really heavily influenced by the fact that the work around suicidal crisis response had been heavily influenced and involved a lot of listening to people who had their own lived experience of suicidal crisis, and the wider agenda and work had as well. But this wee question popped up of, what if we stopped looking at the nature, the technical nature of responses, and we started talking about people's experience of it? So that kind of opened up a whole new lens. And when the researchers looked across the stakeholder engagement work and the narrative analysis that had been undertaken, there was these really strong themes that kept on coming up over and over again. So where people were describing what was strong, they talked about these things of time, space, and compassion. So these were the common themes. And when people were describing a sense of failure, of anger, of frustration with the system, they were often describing absencing of one or more of these things. Now, this really resonated for me when I saw it, because I've got a background in working in group process and I've used constellation and family therapy models in my work. And when I saw this, I saw that really critical thing that we work with people who are experiencing crisis and trauma of, how is time showing up in this moment? What do we have time for? What is it time for? And how do we generate the time that we need to work on this? We also picked up that element of space. So where are we right now? Where would be the place that we could have this conversation? And how can we create the emotional hold for this conversation to happen? So this isn't just about physical or digital space, it's about the space between us and the space within you to start to connect to what this crisis is meaning for you and what might be possible next. And then that really key third theme, which is about how you move from that moment of connection to the moment of action. And in the work, and this was before I came to it, it was described as compassion. In my background, I'm used to hearing it described as an exchange. And that's about how are you and me going to be in this together? What's going to be our relationship? What are going to be the boundaries in that? And how are we going to navigate in it, knowing that boundaries aren't this simple, really simple thing. So I could really see this opportunity of this model that has got decades. I mean, it doesn't come with a theory, does it? It comes with human experience and our relationship and our compassion to each other. But how can we use these themes to start work on how we are in the moment and what Shamila was speaking to, how we are in the system? So how do we start to work in the system with these relational dynamics that can help us move to something more than we are at the moment? So these words really resonated with me, and it's why it drew me to the work. There's a potential of working with this. But when really intrigued me is when we started exploring what do these words mean for different people. And, we've got some of the themes here, but we're just at the start of the journey of this work. And what we would really like to do between now and, well, actually forever, but March next year is a key milestone for us, is start to look at what do these themes of time, space and compassion evoke for you? What do they look like for you from where you're at? And what do they mean to the people that are around you in the work that you're doing? So these are kind of the critical themes. So the recommendations then were developed off of the back of that concept of if we focus on relationship and how we are and where we are with each other, what might we do? So that's kind of where I came in. So I started in January this year, and I'm working alongside a colleague, Nigel Henderson, who was the chief executive of Penumbra, a mental health organisation and provider for many years. And Nigel has been helping us steer and navigate our way through the system with this work. But what we're basically looking at is what are the things that we can do and how can we work and be together in ways that help us grow our capability and our capacity to offer time, space and compassion. Again, not in a sort of patronising way of, like we've just discovered these words and now everybody's got to do it, but that sense of these things are why we came to this work. I'm guessing everybody on the call will be thinking, these are the things that I came into this work to do. But the question then is, where is it really strong? Where are we doing it really well? And where is it thriving? What challenges and problems are we navigating? And what's our hopes for this? So then what through work actively and nationally at a government level and at a national level can we do to release more of that together, knowing that we all have to work together to achieve that? So that's the sort of premise of our work. I know I loved seeing that little triangle pop up in the last presentation because we've got that wee triangle as well. It's lovely to see it just emerging in different places. So if you imagine that, there's all this work around lived experience and existing data, narrative data, as well as, the kind of felt sense of what people have told us about their experience of crisis support. How do we start to navigate our way through developing resources that are going to be really purposeful and accepted by the system? And this triangle has been sort of very critical, I know, to the work of the NSPLG and the lived experience panel around the suicide prevention work. But we've carried that into our work. So we've kind of said, what works? Let's take that and use it again. So as has just been described, we're looking at how can we bring what people with experience of support, so both people who might have experienced suicidal crisis and those, the critical people round about them. What do they view as really important here and to focus on? What are the people designing and commissioning support looking at and thinking about? And what are the people providing support looking at, but with a real underpinning of what's the data and evidence telling us throughout this? So we're trying to look at this from a range of levels and to bring the conversation together around the perspective and the language that the people that we've been working with in the lived experience panel have been using. So my wee graphics haven't come up very well, so we've got wee blue blobs. I signify that this is a bit of work in process. So when we are thinking about how can we start to support and grow capacity and capability to work with time, space, compassion as an embodiment of what people who have lived experience tells us really matters, we're looking at how we can really sort of get into some of the lever points in the system. So we're particularly interested in how we can support integration of time, space, compassion into strategy, commissioning and service design. So what are the practical things people who are doing these roles or working in these roles need to do more around designing time, space, compassion in, when all the pressures in the system and all the pressures around our financing really force us to, you know, potentially prioritise risk mitigation, prioritisation, an austerity mindset, and aspects of the technical redesign over the relational redesign, which is what we're really kind of focusing on. The second being around growing capacity and capability to offer time, space, compassion. So what are all the different ways that we can do and work with that? And also building and sharing our understanding of what's in place and what works. So, you know, like both Nigel and I come from community development backgrounds back in the day. So we are very focused on how can we appreciate what works, learn from that and grow it, knowing that, you know, improvement work doesn't really work in the way, a sense of, oh, A works in that setting, we can just plop it over into B. And that can be as close as, you know, a community just a few miles down the road from another. But it's the learning and the connection and the resilience that comes from working on this stuff together that's really the contagious and transferable thing. So those are our key areas of focus at the moment. So sometimes, some days that seems really crystal clear. Others, it blows my mind. Yeah, and we just constantly, I mean, I think that's always a signal of working with complexity, isn't it? It's like you just, it's like looking at one of those magic eye pictures. Some days you just get a moment of clarity and have that sense of you know where to move, and others it just can feel really overwhelming. And I guess the insight I keep on taking from that is my experience and my own lived experience of supporting someone who experienced suicidality, is that that's what life feels like too. So, you know, we need to work with that in the work as well. So I won't go into this in too much detail, and maybe this is something we could come back to a conversation on if you would really like to. But, you know, as we were starting to think about that and we looked at those themes, we went back and we reconnected with our lived experience panel colleagues, and we kind of said, right, so help us stay focused. What's our North Star, our South Star, and our East and West as we do this work? And we've had 2 conversations now to help us keep on orientating in this complexity. And when we were speaking to folks, what they were really telling us was that they want us to keep a really firm eye on these things. So the sense of person-centeredness, that this is relational, it must be hopeful without gaslighting. So we must set something that's practical and achievable, but not lose hope as we do that. It's got to focus on action. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that the lived experience panel around the NSPLG have brought to the folks that are working in organisations around the work is to say, yeah, so we know this is high risk and we know this is high stakes, but that must not freeze us in our experimentation and our questioning of how we can take action. We have to be trauma informed. And I mean, the kind of lexicon that we have around time space compassion is that time space compassion is the other side of trauma informed practice. It's the outcome that we experience when trauma informed practices are at play. And we have to always be learning, and in the softest ways, in the tricky ways. And there's a phenomenal facilitator and change agent in the US called Adrienne Marie Brown. And I love, she talks about how do we harness and resource ourselves to have the difficult questions, we hold the difficult questions and have the difficult conversations that we've not been having for too long. And I kind of have that sense of the learning needs to be anchored in that ability to have those really tricky conversations. So that those are some of the things that the lived experience panel were really kind of asking us to think about. And then they started to describe how all of those principles were really important, but that it doesn't matter unless practice is happening. So what actually is happening in practice that is going to have, you know, the tangible differences. And I think we've started to hear some of that described in the examples that we've heard so far about how you know, you can talk it, you can feel it, but if you don't have it in your budget, if you don't have it in your organisational structures, then you're not giving yourself the support and structures you're going to need to do tricky work. So those were some of the sort of, you know, the things that people were talking to us about, is like, so these are the practices that we want to see as an end result of that action. So we started to boil that down a little bit and think about, so how can we start to talk to people who are working in responses about what we're hearing from the lived experience panel and what matters. And unsurprisingly, when we are talking to people in responses, this is also what they see as the key challenges. So they've talked about how can we kind of laser our focus down on how people access and have that first experience of a response, their journey through. And journey is a word that we have really kind of struggled with, because the concept of journey often has a start and an end point. And, you know, I'm guessing it's very similar in terms of the recovery and discovery work that you'll be doing in your work, that life ain't linear. Trauma experience isn't linear. So we use journey just as a bit of a metaphor to help us think about the recovery process from suicidality and suicidal crisis, as opposed to suggest a beginning and an end. And then this really important third piece, which is about expectation. And what the lived experience panel was really, I think, if I'm talking really straight, was saying there's been a breakdown of trust between people and the system, and you need to start working on that explicitly and specifically to enable people to experience the good stuff that does exist, and also shape what comes next. So those are our kind of three anchors in our work. And so what we're puzzling on just now is, yes, so that's really useful to know. That's really great insight and direction. But where are some of our levers to start to grow capacity and capability around this? And one of the experiments that we're running just now is the idea of developing a practice framework. So one of the things that I hear quite often, and I've been around as a facilitator for a long time, is that, you know, just no more toolkits. In fact, can you give me a toolkit for the toolkits? So we've taken that to heart a bit and thought about, right, so if we were developing a practice resource, oops, sorry, I think somebody's knocked off their mute. So if we were to develop a practice resource for someone who is sitting right now in an organisation or in a collective and thinking, how can we ensure that we are bringing the best of what we know around what works in the context of suicidal crisis response into our work, where would we go and where would it take us? So that's the sort of question that we've got in our mind. So right now we're prototyping a resource called the Time Space Compassion Framework. It's aimed at people who either work in mental health services or who work in responses where people often express or show up when in crisis. And what we want to do is just share a bit more of the story of the time-space compassion approach. So the concept of describing change from the lens of people's experience, as opposed to how we work on the system or the system itself. We want to offer some really simple self-reflection tools, so that if you do have that one-off opportunity as a team to sit down and think about just how are we doing around those capacities in our team that can help us respond to someone when they're at their lowest and the hardest moment. What might we need to be thinking of based on what we know works in other settings? And then we're going to have a practice library. So I've got the brilliant job at the moment of asking people, where do you see time, space, compassion in spades, even when it's not called that? You know, so where do you just see this embodied in the people around you? And would they be up for talking to us and developing a case study? And what we're basically going to work towards, and we've got about 10 in the going just now in all different settings with different communities of practice, is that we're building these stories about what works in practice. And we're developing those from the lens of what does it mean in practice? What's the evidence telling you, and why are you working this way? And then we're working with people to help them develop an individual's eye view of what it's like to travel through your response, so that we can look at it from those three angles of practice, experience and data. We're also going to work towards community spotlight, so recognising that time, space, compassion, and my experience of it may be very different from someone else's based on my lived experience and where I am in the here and now, the community and the identity that I am. So we want to look at, and in particular, we'll start with those communities that are at highest risk, and we want to develop spotlights to amplify and give insight to what it means to work in this way in a culturally and community sensitive way. And then, yeah, we're just really interested in the conversation that this ignites and how it enables us to help people connect. So these are the questions. These are our big questions, and just really connecting back to, so where and how is it showing up in practice? What made that possible and what has it taken? And what challenges do you see people navigating and their way to getting there? And what can we learn from that? So I guess what I just really like to leave you with today is this is maybe a bit of a conversation starter for us, is about where's the potential to connect, where's the opportunity to reduce confusion and overlap between pieces of work. And I've already heard a couple of things. I'm like, oh, I'm going to go off and find out more about that. But fundamentally, what's your perspective on this? And could we come back together at some point to really mine this and start to generate some really beautiful material about how these things are happening across the systems that you're working across and how we could do something that would support even more of that to happen. So I'll stop there and hand back to Samantha, if that's all right.